Hello and welcome to our panel on aligning technology investments with business outcomes, the roadmap to private 5G. I'm Kelly Hill, executive editor of RCR Wireless News, and thank you for continuing the discussions with us here today. So I'm joined by Jacob Reeb, who is VP of Wireless and Digital Services for Cambridge Consultants, Jason Ayer, who is Technology Department Coordinator for the Murray City School District, Rasmus Helberg, who is Senior Director of Product Management at Qualcomm Technologies, and Stefan Deubel, who is Head of Marketing for Enterprise Solutions with Nokia. Thank you all for joining us today, gentlemen. Right. Well, as we start this discussion and we think about really, what it takes to run a private network, operate a private network, deploy a private network, and we think about the business outcomes that the folks who are looking into these things, are looking for. Can we talk a little bit about the overarching ecosystem? That's sort of where I'd like to start a bit, and talk about what are the pieces of this ecosystem that are needed in order for private networks to take off. In our last session, we sort of talked about, one very specific use case. And I'm hoping that all of you at some point during the discussion today will talk about lessons learned from customers and your own personal experiences. But let's start sort of with the big picture and sort of the state of the ecosystem and to what extent you see it as fully developed. And Stefan, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, it's a very important question because the network is only one piece of the puzzle. When we started in 2011 with the first private wireless deployment in a mine in Australia, it was clearly an issue. We had the network technology to make it happen. The box was maybe a little bit big, but when it came to effectively having machines and system that took private wireless technology, i.e. 4G, LTE, and in the future 5G, that was clearly an issue at the time. I mean, now we've worked with a lot of ecosystem players in pretty much all the segments we address, and they validated the technology. They have system tools, wearables, and many different assets that talks, of wireless technology. So the situation is a lot better. There's still, obviously an aspect of 5G new release where we'll need to see the relevant chipset that has the right industrial feature. And then over time, the industrial OEM to validate the technology, effectively verifying that 5G delivers what's was written in the standard and make sure it meets the requirements for them then to build it into their own ecosystem. But from a 4G LTE today, we've got really good ecosystem now. I think over 6,800 was the last number from GSA of non traditional form factor that supports 4G and LTE. So that's the device aspect of it is one. We talked also about the industrial ecosystem player and the machine, the system. That's another one. And I think it was something that was covered earlier. The spectrum is actually part of the ecosystem is also critical. So this would be for me the top three picks. And I think the device is clearly the one. That's one of the most important that we had to. That takes a long time as well.
Okay, Jacob, I'm going to come to you on this next. And maybe you can give us a little bit of an intro to how Cambridge Consultants sees this ecosystem and the role that you folks play.
Yeah, definitely. From our perspective, we definitely see the evolution of the ecosystem starting to grow where you have companies that are actually looking at building out cellular networks, private cellular networks, right? Enterprise clients, those clients could be utilities, warehousing, logistics, port authorities, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason that they're doing it is to the point that was just brought up, there is an ecosystem from the hardware to the spectrum to AI to the cloud and et cetera. Where we kind of play in this is the reality of intersection between, taking commercial off-the-shelf solutions and marrying that with customization, because each application has unique requirements. And for us, that's where we play. We start to work with organizations taking these solutions, looking at either harsh environment, difficult environments, and mirroring that to ultimately what they're trying to do from the application standpoint. And let's be frank, I think a lot of these companies that are actually looking at building on these ecosystems and doing customization are doing so because they do have those unique requirements that aren't being met by what is currently out there today. And I think that drives part of it. The other part is that a lot of organizations want to own their own data, their own destiny, and potentially see revenue opportunities. So there's a lot at stake for companies to look at this. But again, mirroring the idea of, commercial off the shelf with customization is where we kind of play.
Okay, Rasmus, your thoughts? You're coming at this from a different perspective with Qualcomm, sort of, laying the groundwork and being a foundational technology here.
Yeah, so we both play in the foundational technologies as is known, maybe. I mean, the chipsets for devices and for small cells, but we're also looking into smart to private networks to enable an ecosystem, but a partner ecosystem as well as solutions to simplify. So going back to what Jacob said about customization, I think customization per vertical, per use case and so forth is going to be very important, but to start somewhere, you have to create an ecosystem for the common baseline. So what we are focusing on then is to set up this baseline for a network. If you look at a lot of these customers we have, they don't really have ability to understand 5G on their own. Can't plan, and they cannot sort of manage 5G generally. They really typically want an end-to-end solution, one-stop solution. So to start somewhere, you need a baseline that is, we think is multi-vendor, that you can customize a program so you can set up for certain use cases, but then to really scale this and then meet the customer demand, you need to work from this network baseline to work with specific system integrators or channels that have the specific knowledge for that vertical, but then tweak the RAN and add the use cases and the program it for these use cases as needing, and also customize. So I think this also goes maybe a little bit hand in hand with Open RAN and the modern network, where you have programmability and intelligence and AI to tweak and customize as needed for specific verticals, but have a common baseline.
So, and Jason, I'm excited to hear what you think about the state of the ecosystem, because you're an actual private network operator in that sense. Maurice,
that's correct. We've been doing this for 3 years. I like to think of it like a triangle. You've got the EPC core components, you've got the radio area network components, and then you've got the end user device components. And our experience over starting with this a few years back, we haven't ever had problems with the core and with the radio speaking to each other. That part seems to be very well taken care of, and it seems to be a great way that people are following the standards. What we are finding is that the end user devices, if you don't find a vendor that's completely open and unlocked with their chipsets, that you'll find devices that you might buy somewhere and expect them to work, and they don't. And I think that's where the industry is getting better. And we've definitely seen improvement over the past 3 years, but I think that's a place where the industry can do better. And I think you'll see some of the end user device manufacturers actually having a private division that understands that and make sure they ship you the right part number that's unlocked and is going to open up and work with your solution.
Okay. So, Jason, I'm going to start with you on this one again, because I was looking over the website for the network that you folks run, and there's a lot of you have a lot of information on there. You have a lot of sort of how-tos and and just sort of guidelines, and and so I'm wondering, can we talk a little bit about tools and knowledge that are available for for planning purposes, for deployment purposes? Because what my impression is that you folks have put a lot of things together just from your own direct experience, and that kind of tells me that maybe, especially when you got started, it didn't really exist.
Sure. When we started, there wasn't an end-to-end solution. I am happy to say there are vendors and integrators like Jacob and others that are doing that more on the private side, that maybe we just didn't find them back when we were first looking. But our goal, we had seen some school districts do closed networks with a single vendor and then have that vendor exit the market, or have some vendors that were kicked out of our domestic market in the United States. And so given some of those risks, we tried to do the network that we put together as open as possible. And the knowledge, being in education, and some of the, like, we showed up on the Today Show, not on purpose. It was just, they showed up with the crew and we talked to them. but getting some of that national publicity started, having a lot of people, especially in education, reach out to us. And we needed a way to help people understand this. We also, it's never been my intent at Murray or the Utah Education and Telehealth Network, which is the bigger organization we work with. It's never been our intent to make this a single vendor. This is who we prefer, those kind of things. We've tried to make it as open as possible and bring everybody to the table that's doing devices and those things. And so we hope that openness, and as Rasmus said, now that we're seeing in 5G New Radio, the Open RAN and even more of those specifications, we're excited to see how many more vendors and pieces can come to the table for that.
Stefan, you also, in some of our pre-panel discussions, mentioned that Nokia has some tools available to folks who are looking to, learn more, think about planning, etc.
Yes, I mean, this is indeed something that we've learned over the last 10 or 12 years, where clearly the enterprise that we deal with are not telecom expert. There was in the past with 3GP technology a bit of a high learning curve when it comes to how to optimize those rates. There's a lot of tools and capability just in Scheduler. There's over 300 different settings you can play with to improve the performance. So one of the first things that we've done is actually make our telecom solution enterprise friendly, and that was sometimes it's easier to make something more complex over time, but actually here we had to narrow it down and bring it to the simple things that enterprise would understand. There was also an evolution of the solutions themselves, make it simpler, smaller, cheaper, and I think a lot of work around the O&M, around the automation aspect of it, to make those systems easier to deploy and optimize. So these are more on the network side of things. And one of our solution, we have two private wireless solutions. One of them is effectively designed as a service solution that's edge-centric but cloud managed, which means you get the benefit of the technology, you get the low latency because you've got an edge, yet you've got expert, either Nokia or some other partners, that manage that network for you and ensure it delivers the KPI your use cases expect. That's one aspect of it. The other one is trying to understand what the networks would look like for you. So, we've got, for example, online a tool that enables you to do a bit of radio planning. So you can, go into a map, zoom into your site, and it will try to estimate the number of cells you will need, gives you a rough estimation of coverage. You can change the frequency, so if you want CBRS, you will see what it looks like with CBRS. If you want 2.6 TD-LTE for France, then you can again adjust that. So that also will give you, a rough idea of what the network would look like, both outdoor and indoor. The other aspect that we ask often is the cost. A lot of people again are worried about those technology. They heard about, the operator buying license for, billions, and then the networks being those expensive tower they see on the side of the motorway when they drive around. So, one of the big aspects was also trying to understand, okay, what is the benchmark? And the benchmark was Wi-Fi. So what we did is we built a tool that's also available online. It's a simplified version, but or folks in the field have the real one, where you can effectively say, okay, I'm a mining customer, or I'm a port customer, or I'm in manufacturing, and what does it would look like from a cost point of view? So you can select and adjust the size of your network, the type of use case you'll be running, whether you have already the device, you need to buy them, what kind of spectrum, and it will give you a rough estimation of what the total cost of ownership for the network over 5-7 years, and compare that and benchmark that to Wi-Fi. And and that was one of the reasons we built the tool as well, was there is a perception out there that Wi-Fi is cheaper. But in fact, with private wireless and the technology, when you consider the amount of coverage you get from every single small cell, the fact it can support a lot higher number of users at the same time per cell, then you effectively realize very often in reasonable size deployment, actually private wireless is also more cost effective. So in fact, the cost is no longer a barrier, and that's why what we designed the tool for in the first place.
Okay. Jacob, your thoughts on planning tools and what's available now versus maybe what you'd like to see available, and what your customers are what and really what you are able to do, and how you've approached that side of the deployment.
Yeah, and we've covered a lot of topics here, and one of them ultimately being the ability to have some flexibility as our network's concerned, right? And there was a comment about O-RAN and several different aspects. So we could start with O-RAN and basically state from our perspective, what we see in this is the ability to have a baseline, a foundation that we talked about. But similar in the way I would equate this is it's similar to Salesforce, where you get Salesforce into your as a CRM tool, but the reality of it is you have to build it towards your industry or your enterprise, and that's the same thing here. At least we have a baseline; you can start to move that forward. And then the other thing that Stefan just kind of talked about is a little bit of an area that we concentrate on. Our three visionary areas are network transformation, digital transformation, and intelligent or building intelligent networks. The very first one is world first type of scenarios, right? You're talking like satellite communication, ground to sky. Where a lot of this falls into is digital transformation, which is private cellular networking, right? Where do we build this? How do we build this into an enterprise scenario? And the last, kind of building those intelligent aspects to all of it. So from our perspective, what we see here and the tools that we're looking at is we're releasing a white paper here at the end of the month or early June, where we kind of get into intent-based networks, which in essence are talking about the application and utilizing what's out there today in the tools, but starting to move that forward. My vision of the future is simply that as you start to go, Jason has an education system. There's other organizations that have logistics, warehousing, port authorities. My vision of it is at some point, there's going to be a baseline where you can choose specifically what you would like to see as a baseline to build that up and through to your application, hence intent-based networks, right? The ability to adjust, build that intelligence, and make this utilized. And the last thing I'll touch on is always that conversation, Wi-Fi versus cellular. The biggest thing that we've seen from our perspective is capacity, right? You're doing this, and at some point you stretch the capacity of how many units and how often they communicate when you start to do Wi-Fi, right? And that's where cellular starts to beat it, is the ability to actually have that capacity and start to grow your organization from not today, but 5 years down the line of exactly what you're trying to do. And that's where we see that collision between, full automation and connectivity, the ability to actually start to put this whole idea together by utilizing a wireless technology that gives you that scale and that capacity.
Okay. Rasmus, any thoughts on sort of this question of customability and tools, and just any thoughts on I think it's certainly interesting when we talk about features and capabilities from a chipset level.
No.
But I don't know if you have any thoughts on tools.
No, I think it continued to what I said before, but I think Jack covered very well too. I mean, you need a baseline and you need the programmability to customize for specific verticals and use cases and so forth, and add the use cases you need. And Oran is one way to do that. So then you can talk about automation on different level, because the ultimate goal is the digital transformation, automation in manufacturing, warehousing, and so forth. That's automation solutions at top. So we're working with a device partners to build solutions like AGV, AMR, security cameras, LiDAR, and so forth. That's not only the device, but also ready-to-go solutions for specific verticals that might even be managed service, but have all the other components. So that's the automation for the end customer. But equally important is the automation for the network itself, to make it as simple and scalable to self-optimize, automatic plug-and-play deployments, simplify planning, and so forth, to get these templates to maybe duplicate this deployment and scale it across multiple industries, but still have this opportunity to customize and differentiate for specific verticals and use cases. So I think with Oran and the programmability and so forth, we can get this kind of baseline. Obviously, you need different base station depending on if it's indoor and outdoor and so forth, but still you can get a baseline connectivity, and then you can add the use cases on top and tweak it program it for what is needed. So that I agree, that's very important.
Okay.
And I wanted to, if you don't mind, Kelly, bounce back on what Jacob and Rasmus were saying. I think I like the idea of intent-based networks and what Rasmus was saying about the use case, because again, we're talking networks and technology here, but it's all about the use case. This is really often where it comes down to. And I think, one of the things that what we've learned over the time is once you've done 10 or 20 deployment in a specific type of mine, let's say an open pit copper mine, then you realize you will always need the same ecosystem player. And the network is one aspect, but then the other part that's also very complex is, how do I make this use case work, with that system? How do I system integrate the use case with the network technology? And this is something that also takes a long time if you have not done it before. And one of the things that we try to do to simplify that approach is create what we call segment blueprints. And it's basically working with in-house expert that we have on the vertical side to say, okay, Coppermine equal this type of network, this type of configuration, and guess what? We will always be finding, Case, Komatsu, and Volvo for the mining truck, but for underground, the different companies. So why don't we just go preemptively test and integrate those solutions, the autonomous haulage system software, for example, and verify that upfront, like that when we get the next Coppermine, then we don't have to customize the solution 15 to 20%. It's only maybe a matter of 3 to 5% customization for the complete solution. So there's one aspect of it, and that's why also in this market, the system integrator has a significant play, because the enterprise are used to buy a complete solution, and the system integrator are the one that make it happen. And that's why the system integrator come up very often in all the analyst survey as one of the key channels as well for private wireless, because they're able to bring that complete solution with the networks and everything that goes around it, the device, the application, everything, but also integrate that with the use case, with the OT system of those kind of OT companies. And I think that's very important as well, because again, like devices, a network on its own is a bit pointless. You need the whole thing to deliver value, and it's business value we're talking about.
Yeah, and
okay. Oh, go ahead, Jacob. You wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. He just brought up a mining scenario and all the end nodes that are connected to it, and that's something as well that you have to take into consideration. Of it's just not one to build the network; it is one to understand not only the end nodes, development of those end nodes, and the impact to the network of those end nodes. And then end nodes could be numerous things, from utilities all the way to warehousing, logistics, right, robotics, etc. Even for Jason, a community of educators or the students that are on there, you need to understand that. So those are all the pieces that kind of go through, and the tools you'll have to start to think of how you're actually designing that network and the impact of how things fluctuate depending on that application.
Okay, so these sound like real world lessons learned. Stefan, you mentioned specifically, being able to isolate, the three most common, trucks that need to be connected. And Jason, I wanted to come back to you on some of, real world lessons you're seeing. So you're running a CBRS network, you're using GAA, if I remember correctly. You folks have a lot of campuses that are connected to this network. Tell us about some of it, and you folks have been doing this for 3 years, which is a long time in the CBRS world. So tell us a little bit about what your experience has been as, an educational system that is, that is part of a private network.
Sure. Excuse me. Probably some of the most interesting lessons learned is everyone jumps to distance learning and off campus as a use case. And we're doing that in Murray, and there are a few other communities that do that. Some of the federal grant programs that exist that provide internet to schools in the United States actually don't allow for that. And so what we tried to do for the districts that didn't have dedicated bandwidth that wasn't subsidized, we looked at on-campus use cases and focused this as a learning experience, so to speak. And we found some interesting lessons that we learned. We did find that there are a lot of different campus use cases for sports applications. There's applications, security cameras. Almost every school district is doing something for school safety and security cameras, for example. And then oftentimes there's places where it's just too expensive to run fiber optics and it's too long for copper, those types of things. We found those types of use cases and have been very excited about what we've been able to learn and do with those. We do have over 30 campuses, and we are finding commonalities, but we're also pushing people to be creative. Probably one of the most creative use cases we hadn't thought about was introducing this technology to students and using it as a way to prepare them for careers as well. And so that's kind of been the icing on the cake for us. And we hope to do more with that as we start to explore maybe a cell on wheels or other portable things to take our network and be able to do more in rural areas than we're doing now and things like that.
Okay, so a combination of human end users and IoT as well there. Interesting stuff. Jacob, do you want to jump in on, what you're seeing in terms of real world lessons learned?
Yeah, I think, some of the lessons that we've learned, again, is this is ever evolving, and there's a lot of tools out there, potentially open source and et cetera. But again, the lesson we've learned is the fact that each application is unique. There is some difficulty as it relates to it. And for us, what we do is we try to work with, system providers and et cetera to help them build defendable positions in what they're trying to accomplish, right? And address each one of those. As far as lessons learned, I think a lot of organizations get themselves in trouble because they make a really large assumption at the very beginning of what they're going to do, which isn't based on, let's say, what is the best option, but as far as what's the lowest cost option that we can potentially do. Example would be Wi-Fi. We're going to roll out Wi-Fi. We're going to do this, and or not realizing what's happening. I'll also state that real lessons learned is the fact that a lot of companies will start with a POC, and either they move to production or stretch the bounds of what they've done in that POC in production. And there's these unknowns, and that's where we consider that canyon. They come to the canyon and they don't understand the bridge that they need to build to get across. And that's where organizations like ourselves can help out. So I think, lessons learned basically would state that, engage experts in what you're trying to accomplish from not only a design perspective, but from an advisory service wrapped around technology to understand exactly what's out there and what's available to those organizations, and as well as the technology that can go through it. And ultimately, someone asked a little bit about ROI, TCO, all that kind of stuff. Really what this comes down to is that when you're doing this, you're looking at trying to build, and it's the same of any industry, you're trying to either build efficiencies or you're trying to build a new revenue stream. And if you keep that in mind and build that up from there, I think that's where you can end up helping yourself and your organization grow, and take this from not an advantage of this is an operational expense, but some way to actually make this relative to the organization to grow that revenue stream or help cut down on and bring efficiencies to the organization.
Rasmus, any thoughts on what you're seeing from customers, from folks who are dealing with this in the real world?
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement about 5G and use cases, and many enterprises, they find some use case they think it's really good and they want to use, but there's also the need to find a broad range of 5G use cases and motivates the whole investment in 5G. So that's something we work on, to have this menu of use cases, because they might start with one and two, and then you have to find all the other ones that makes it exciting. The other part of pilots and trials, I mean, you can do a lot of pilots and trials, then you can have a lot more manual interaction. You can set it up, it can be on-prem, it doesn't have to be perfect. But to really get it to commercialization and scale, it has to be much simplified, automated, and manageable. So that's also the solutions that needed to bring this in a bigger scale also for, we discussed, I think we didn't discuss it yet, but if you prefer a managed service to be able to do it across a lot of sites, or even some prefer self-managed management. So the solutions to bring it from trials and 5 different trials and pilots is also require some additional solutions. So simplify management and also deployment at scale and so forth.
Okay. Stefan, I want to get to you on this one as well. You mentioned a few things, but.
Yeah, I was also, interesting because, I think things have changed a lot in the last 2 years. And, we were talking about trials and POCs. And for me, I've seen the industry changing significantly, where maybe a few years back, we were initially starting with a deployment in a lab, extending to then the first site, factory, playing around with one use case, or the driver was a single use case that was not working. And I think we've now moved across where, in the last 2 years, we're seeing that we've done enough of this kind of use case for enough segments to have proven enough and have enough facts and data to show the benefits. That I think we've moved to a completely different mode. So yes, there's still some trials on 5G, because again, we are lacking the devices, we are lacking the latest industrial feature that are yet to come in the chipset, like URLLC, TSN, TSC. But when it comes to 4G, and LTE, that's, by the way, enough to run, in excess of 80 or 90% of the use cases we see in the industrial space. It's no longer trials and POCs. I mean, we are seeing, we've just Nokia, we've got over 450 customers, pretty much, in 50 countries. We've got close to probably 1,500 networks are out there. What we're seeing now is our customers are signing up for deals directly for 20 sites, 40 sites, 50 sites, and they straight away has a clear plan on, these are the 5 use cases I need straight away, and a roadmap to the next 5, and a roadmap to the following 5. So that has changed significantly from I play around, I check it, I test it, and then I multiply, to now they trust the technology, they trust what they've seen or what we show them in other customers or what they've heard from their competitors, because we shouldn't forget private wireless is about giving you a competitive differential when it comes to the digital transformation. If you're able to do that early, you'll gain efficiency early, you'll gain flexibility early, and you'll be more competitive in this market, as simple as that, and more sustainable, or even more secure, making a better environment for your worker to work with. Some environments are quite dangerous for workers as well. So it plays on a lot of different dynamics. And I think we've shown over the time, really the benefit the technology can bring. On a single use case, we've seen, like AGVs or autonomous port system, for example, we've seen ROI calculation that indicates a payback for the networks as a matter of days. We're not talking years, we're talking 6 days, 15 days, 20 days. This is the kind of value, a simple change of technology for even the same time of use case does. In the case, for example, of autonomous haulage truck in mining, you see some gain on fuel, you see some gain on the breakage on the trucks because they have to brake less often. You see trucks being more efficient because they don't have to go around corner, they can just go forward and then backward. There's so many things like that where as soon as you calculate, you realize actually the network is a very small part of the puzzle. The data it carries, it's extremely valuable. And if you're able to do the analytics that goes behind this data, and then you bring even more value. And that's why Edge and private wireless are some of the 2 most important tools when it comes to Industry 4.0 transformation. When you're able to bring the pieces together, then you bring significant value. And then it's not even just the TCO, it's an ROI on the network. As I said, it's a few days worth of gains.
All right. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people happy to hear that. So we're getting some more audience questions in, and again, folks, we'll get to as many of these as we can. I think this is sort of a version of the perennial question of, do you go with private cellular or do you go with Wi-Fi? So the question is, what are the considerations for going with private 5G versus Wi-Fi 6 or 7, considering that Wi-Fi 6 or 7 also provides high gigabit speeds and low latency. And Jason, I'm going to start with you on this one because you had to have figured that into your calculations, as you considered whether to go with private cellular or whether to go with Wi-Fi.
Sure, and that is probably the question that everybody asks. That's probably the biggest consideration. The best analogy I've heard is it's kind of like a kindergarten classroom, your wireless network. If there's a teacher in the room, that's more like the 3GPP, where the core is managing and handling things and keeping everything from bouncing around. Wi-Fi is kind of like the room without the teacher. The teacher leaves the room, the energy goes up, it's faster, it's more energetic, but it doesn't necessarily get your data where it needs to go sometimes. And then just a quick 4 things: scale, distance, latency, and security. The 3GP technologies were designed with scale in mind first and foremost. And so the challenge we're having is getting them to scale down, whereas Wi-Fi, it's always seemed to be scaling up. And the congestion is very real in Wi-Fi. Second is distance. Wi-Fi is designed to be kind of a close proximity, not as close as Bluetooth, kind of in the middle. And then 3GPP standards and LTE and 5G are designed to be more at a distance, and that core and the management of that takes that distance into perspective, which is important because Wi-Fi doesn't work at the long distances the same way. Latency, Wi-Fi latency is kind of like that energetic classroom. It is all over the place, up and down, and especially at conferences and places where it's congested, that latency becomes more inconsistent. Whereas even in a congested conference area, the latency on LTE, it's a little bit higher than Wi-Fi, but it's almost a straight line. And so the consistency of your latency plays into that decision. And then the last thing is security. And Wi-Fi security will evolve as well. But you do have a nice SIM-based or an eSIM-based security inside the 3GPP that may make that a consideration for some of your more sensitive or more proprietary data. Kind of going back to what Stefan and what Jacob were saying earlier with the intent-based networks. those are my thoughts.
Okay, great. Stefan, your thoughts on this, and then Jacob, I'll come to you on Wi-Fi versus private networks.
Yeah, and Jason, I was laughing because I loved your little analogy here with a teacher, because that was the way I explained people about the scheduler before. Scheduler, no scheduler. You know, a scheduler is a teacher that's got ears that can listen to different frequency and can cut every few milliseconds. And without a scheduler, is a teacher that's got a crowded room and just ask questions all over the place. So absolutely love that, and you can tell you're in from the education market. But I think you've said it all. I mean, for me, first of all, let's be clear. Private wireless will not replace Wi-Fi when it comes to the IT space. This is the right technology for the right needs. It's perfect, okay? But when it comes to OT, this is where private wireless clearly fits the bill. And I think you've said it all. We are talking about often, at least in asset-heavy industry, very tough radio environments with metal everywhere, shelf filling in and out in warehouses, and a new machine being deployed that's like 5 meter high, or ceiling that are 30 meter. That's the reality. You put a Wi-Fi access point, it barely touch the floor with the coverage. That's the reality. So tough radio environment. Secondly, people in Neil's market, they're used to an Ethernet cable, which is a very nice medium. You just plug it, you'll get a gig, or you get 100 meg. That's the reality. Even if the few switch, the latency will stay the same. Most use cases actually are not about high gig in those environments. They're about deterministic, ensuring the packets get delivered on time and always within the same time. Determinism is key, and that's what really makes the difference with private wireless. Then beyond that, coverage, Jason talked about it, but when you're trying to get a sensor inside the machine that's inside a metal cage, which got inside also some metal barriers around, then you need deep penetration. Again, that's where it's not just about wide outdoor coverage, it's also about getting to the sensor that in the basement on your heating system or something like this. Again, so coverage makes a lot of difference. We talked about predictability, but there's also one aspect that people forget is mobility. This is critical in many use cases. In factories, you've got AGVs that move around, you've got forklift truck. In ports, you've got gantry cranes or rubber tire cranes as well that moves around. And again, the handover time of Wi-Fi that can be 50 milliseconds if you're lucky, but sometimes it's 400 milliseconds and can happen to go to 15 seconds. That means the machine stops, for example. So mobility is also a very important aspect for everything that moves, and in industry, things move. And the final thing that I will say is also the low power sensor are also very important. So with 3GPP, the same radio also, depending on your spectrum band, can also spit out something called narrowband IoT or LTE-M, which guarantees you can have low battery consumption sensor that don't even need power for wiring for bringing the power to that thing, because the battery lasts a few years. So when you've got all these old machines in factories that need to be digitalized, if they've got a modern and digital PLC, then it's quite straightforward. But when you've got a very old press or a very old machine, then having wireless sensors deployed means that you can digitize the machine very rapidly. You don't need to take it out, stop it from production, send it out for certification, etc. It takes years sometimes. You just put, wireless sensors inside. Okay, you have to think about changing the battery every 4 years. So what? At least digitalize. So a lot of values in private wireless, but again, it's not a replacement. Wi-Fi can also be used, by the way, in like non-critical OT use cases. If it's the guy that walks around the factory needs to see his manufacturing system. If it's AR, VR, which is not for critical repairs, that's probably going to be fine. So it's again the right courses for horses, or horses for courses. That's all about finding the right technology that fits the use case.
Okay, Jacob, your thoughts on this? I'm curious as to what you see.
Yeah, I mean, I think they covered the very top level aspects of what happens and why you would end up using private wireless or cellular over Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing to think of that we haven't brought up yet is, legacy equipment. So again, it's one thing Jason's actually looking at, students and people that are jumping on these networks. It gives them the flexibility that covers a large area. That's the reason you probably move to cellular. I correlate it to this, that if you're working with a utility and they suddenly decided they wanted to flip the switch, moving their SCADA system fully over to a cellular network, what that would mean, you're suddenly moving to a bunch of machines that are old. And the adage I have is that we used to live in an area where we consistently were losing power. And I happened to be meeting with the energy provider in the area And I asked him, I'm like, what's going on? And he basically said the recloser is breaking. And I asked the question, I'm like, how old is a recloser? And it was built in 1936. Now think about putting that on a network that's, as everybody talked about, unpredictable, different latencies that causes major issues. So I think that's the other aspect that you look at, right? What are we looking at from a standpoint of, you're not going to replace every single device out there, and you're going to have to put things out there or communicate to devices that are very old. The other aspect, again, I think is security, and it's a big, big piece. I mean, when we started putting IoT devices on the networks, I remember the state of Illinois had an issue where a couple of water treatment plants were hacked into. Now, mind you, the hackers didn't have an idea what they're doing with the PLCs that were communicating that were old, but they shut down the water facility, right? The water treatment plant. And that's a big thing. And for us to move forward in the 21st century, you need to have a standard. You need to start looking at how you protect yourself against cybersecurity. And it's an aspect that you have to start looking at of what you're doing. Now, again, Wi-Fi has its play, LPWAN has its play, but a lot of cases, when you start looking at the applications that a lot of people are looking at for 5G, autonomous vehicles, robotics, right? These are things that are going to demand a specific network. And I'll end by saying, again, we're talking about machines for the most part that are communicating versus devices like iPhones and et cetera, that have a lot of attributes that will need something that is very predictable that we've already talked about so far.
Okay, Rasmus, I'm going to come to you real quickly on this Wi-Fi versus 5G questions and choosing between the two, and then we'll wrap up with one additional question.
I think we covered this very well, so I don't think I have too much to add. I think Jason started very well. I think the only thing maybe to add is it's also the density aspect, indoor, outdoor, and the use cases that depends on if you need mobility and so forth. Many use cases, Wi-Fi will be fine. Yeah, so since we covered that a lot, I don't think I mean, we support, of course, Wi-Fi and cellular and all technologies and Wi-Fi and private 5G will coexist.
Okay. So I think all four of you in various ways have referred to this sort of the development over the last couple of years and seeing projects move from a pilot stage to full deployments, and folks moving from sort of playing around to having a much firmer idea of where they're going with private networks and what they want to accomplish. So, as we think about moving from pilot projects to full deployments, what are some of the common stumbling blocks or sort of pain points that you see? And then let's also, because this is something else that most of you have mentioned, what does scalability mean when you're talking about networks that, may need a lot of customization? This question of sort of scaling up for, multiple sites in the same industry, multiple customers, but then there's also this question of scaling down to, the individual, maybe small to medium business, is that feasible at this point? So let's talk, let's end on this question of sort of pilot projects, common pain points and scalability. And Rasmus, I'm going to start with you. Just any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so when I mentioned about the scaling up, I talked about 5G. I mean, I agree that 4G is being deployed and so forth, but there's a lot of interest in going directly to 5G because that's the more future-proof technology. So I think we still have some efforts there to get the POC, the trials to big scale deployments. Part of that is what I said with the devices, but that's what we are working heavily on to get the solutions going, not only the specific devices, but integrated with warehouse, smart factory, and so forth solutions. To scale, I mean, the scale is multiple aspects. I think if you have what we talk about intent-based or programmable, you can scale for use cases across broad use cases and verticals like mining or warehouses, as well as customize for a specific customer. If you make the network programmable or customizable with the same common hardware and solution. So that is possible with the promise of O-RAN and so forth. And so I think that scalability is possible on a big scale to meet all this with a common baseline, meet the different verticals with a specific configuration for specific use cases, as well as doing customization for a specific customer that would need it if you make it programmable.
Okay, Jacob, really quickly, we've got about another minute. So
yeah, I'll give everybody a chance here, but I think really the biggest thing to look at that we've seen so far is to have that vision in mind of what you're trying to accomplish. Too many times you start a POC just by saying, let's test this technology, and not realizing what the end result is of what you're trying to accomplish from a technology standpoint. And I think that's something that organizations need to look at, because as you start to dig into it, you realize the different applications, the amount of data that you potentially could be pulled, and you get inundated by all these possibilities. And that's where POCs tend to have the issue to move into production. So leave it at that and give everybody else a chance here to talk.
Okay, Stefan, your thoughts real quick, and then we'll wrap up with Jason.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on that topic, it's interesting. I mean, the networks that we're deploying, the technology is designed for, catering for very, very large number of people on a single site. So, we are yet to find out of the, 1,500 networks we have so far, any networks that run out of capacity, even on 4G, and despite sometime having 20, 30 use cases running. So, I would not worry about that. It's kind of the opposite. I think Jason mentioned that a little bit earlier. Both technology are really designed for handling the capacity and providing deterministic performance, even when you got high load on it. And, the 4G, 5G for me is also not a problem. Most of the private wireless solutions you found out there today are, 5G SA upgradable with a piece of software. The only thing you'll have to do is add a few additional 5G cell in your factory or in your site when that's needed. By the way, 5G is often different frequency. You need higher grade MIMO, i.e. more antennas. You'll need new cells anyway. You'll put them in your site. You just one few other additional cells here and there, and you'll be fine. And by the way, the 4G system that you'll be probably running it for the next 20 years, like the press or the utility recloser we're talking about anyway. Okay. And finally, the last thing I would say is one of the big feedback we get from customers is, I didn't realize that, but this network, we just deployed it and we forget it. It's not like all the other wireless technology that we had before, where any change in a factory, any environment change, or anything that we did implied us getting around and reorientating the antenna or adding more cells because the Wi-Fi capacity was struggling. We just deploy and forget. And I think that's a big, big thing as well, a big value in terms of simplicity.
Okay, great. Jason, your thoughts very quickly.
Sure, very quickly. Your proofs of concept, use it to explore the technology, understand what it is, but know as you go into production that there are a lot more features and tweaks, because this is a modern design system. And I think you'll find a lot of great surprises there.
Okay, I like that. That's a good end note. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And that we hope that you'll join us for our next session, which is a case study on Smart Sky and taking private networks to the sky.